Okay, maybe we should try to start our last session. I think people are moving back very hesitantly from the break there. So we'll end today with a beautiful talk to be delivered by Victor. Victor is the Carson Professor of Economics at University of Minnesota. And everybody know his work in macro. With many things, he work on macro with public finance, macro with labor, and the macro with like asset pricing. Tons of different things. But if you really want to name him in one sentence, I think you can call him Mr. Quantitative Macro. Okay, so let us welcome Victor. And Victor, you are the only person in between. Right before our beautiful reception. By the way, the reception is full of food. So it is really dinner and with open bar. All you could drink.
Okay, well, thanks very much, and thanks for inviting me here. I'm very happy. And thanks to you to come. It's been the longest day I remember of any conference it's almost 12 hours, so thanks very much for coming. Okay, I'm going to talk about more than one paper. So it's going to be some stuff I've been working with Zenwell and Jan Bay and Kjetil Storres-Letten, who will be here tomorrow, I think. So you know this, we had a Great Recession. It's been big, both in the US and in Southern Europe. And that involves a large decline in everything, in output, employment, consumption, and investment. But it also implies that households reduce their indebtedness. And at least in many of the countries, there has been a massive reduction in housing prices. But at the same time, TFP dropped. So let me show you some of to get you an idea and convince you that the recession has been large. This is US data. They trended at 2%, so pretty much the average, or a little bit less than 2%, which is pretty much the average of the last 30 years or so. So output went down by about 10%. Unemployment went from 4.5 to 10. And what chunks of output went down? Well, most of them. Consumption, which is the biggest one, 2/3 of output, well, it went down about 10, 12%. Investment went down 30%. So the recession has been big. But look at, associated to that, there was a big reduction in how much the economy is worth. So the US economy had a wealth to output ratio of almost 5 just before the recession. And it lost 1 GDP in a year or two. So 1 GDP that was in people's pockets disappeared. At the same time, household indebtedness plummeted. And you can see that just before the opposite happened, but I'm talking mostly at the post-2008. And housing value to output, as I said, went down a lot. The last graph is labor quality adjusted productivity. Productivity went down. One of the things that we also have to remember is that the recession affected mostly the poor people, in the sense that they are the ones who were affected most adversely by unemployment. And as a result, the quality of the labor force went up during the recession. So if you adjust for that, clearly productivity got a big drop. And this is the peaks, some data for Southern Europe and Ireland. You can see that TFP also dropped, employment massively dropped, and the recession involved also massive decrease in consumption. So what we want to do here is to ask, can we provide a theory of a recession based on reductions in household consumption? Can these be triggered by a reduction in household consumption? And if you read the newspapers, you see that it's blamed on some kind of financial shock. And we have some big literature on how financial shocks channel through firms. Bernanke, Gertler, and stuff like that. And that is going on through the wrong firms are doing the investment, or they're not doing investment enough. But I want to think of it as something that affects people, consumers. So such adverse financial shock induce people to save more and trigger the recession. Question, can we have this in an economy where we have more than consumption, where the output could be used to invest or export, and where prices and wages are reasonably flexible, but not just rigid, like absolutely rigid, like some people have posed? And in the context of the standard macro theory, and I'm using standard in a very narrow growth model sense, the answer is no. Adverse wealth shocks generate expansions. You get poorer, the roof of your house is blown away by a storm, you work harder, you fixed it. It's miserable, but recession you're not going to have. But I want to provide a model or an environment where, yes, the recession can be based by a financial shock that affects consumers only. And there are three things that are going to be important. That the economy cannot turn on its toes immediately from consumption to investment or export. There has to be adjustment cost of production. Spain or Greece cannot stop having espressos and start getting the labor and capital to sell color TVs to Taiwan. That's just not easy. You have to think of output as just something more than one uniform good. There has to be some labor friction so that the wage cannot drop dramatically, but you don't need much. The minor frictions associated to the modus imperieris frictions are more than enough to get the type of recessions I'm going to talk about. And most importantly, I'm going to provide a way of thinking of TFP as endogenous. It's going to be good market frictions that are going to make the productivity look as if it was, make productivity look procyclical even though nothing is going on the production side. So to put it in context, let's review standard theory. Standard theory has three equations. The first one is an intertemporal Euler equation. You consume today and tomorrow, and there is an interest rate in the process. It's mostly uncontroversial, despite its colossal failure in terms of accounting for the equity premium puzzle. But let's ignore that, and let's get this equation out of the way. The second one is a static first-order condition. This is a massive failure. A massive failure if we want to understand movements in hours as people choosing optimally how much to work or how little. So because it does terrible, typically we get rid of it. And there are two ways of getting rid of it. One is posting fixed wages. The other one is posting some labor frictions, la modus imperieris. But the model that everybody's been happy with is the production function. That equation has been completely uncontroversial and very popular in most macro models. Sometimes a little bit more sophisticated than this, but for all practical purposes is not. And that is my enemy. That's the one I'm going to try to convince you that we should do without. Okay, so let's look at the production function and let's put capital. Okay? So output is a function of capital, labor, and some other stuff. We're going to call it Z, and we tend to think of it as productivity. Well, output changes over the cycle. That's the whole point of calling a cycle, is that output goes up and down. Well, capital doesn't move because it doesn't have time to move, because capital is a slow-moving beast, and investment barely touches it. So labor moves. So the only things that can move are either productivity, this residual object out there, or labor. And if productivity doesn't move, decrease in returns to scale require that labor productivity and wages drop if labor increases. because there has to be decrease in returns for this production function to be coherent. So typically what we do is we have observations of capital and labor, and we pose something like an aggregate production function that looks like Cobb-Douglas, and that's based mostly in the fact that labor share has been constant. It's going down a lot lately, but the first approximation, that's constant. And that implies that that equation now defines Z as a residual. And when we look at it, when we look at that residual, we see that it's strongly correlated with output. And since we have no theory of that, that explains the popularity of TFP shocks. Now, these technology shocks, productivity shocks, are something that only educated economists, educated macroeconomists of a certain age have ever seen. Nobody else has ever seen them. Not older people, not businessmen, no macroeconomists. We have had 30 years or so with TFP shocks, productivity shocks, and nobody that I know has come up with some micro study and say, yeah, here they are. Here they are. We found them. This is how they show. No, it's always a residual. So I'm done with this 30 years. Moreover, the notion that all goods produced are sold underlies these notions. What about services, short-lived manufacturing goods? This really is that. I want to call that 19th century economics. 19th century economics, when you produce, is wheat. You sell the wheat. But what happens in a restaurant? They have the shrimp, they have the labor. If we're lucky, they have the air conditioned. But output only happens if customers show up. If customers don't show up, there is no output. And I want to use that idea thoroughly. So my main point is that there are other ways of thinking about the changing gap between a stable combination of inputs and output. And it requires something that moves cyclically and that is improperly measured. And I'm going to claim that it's the contribution of households of firms who actively participate in the consumption or investment process and whose engagement is necessary for output to occur. And just as I said, restaurants need diners. Unless people show up, output doesn't happen. And I'm going to choose an example care to me because that's what my grandfather used to do. Podologists need toes. My grandfather could spend the morning in his office with his chair, his barber chair, a very good pair of German pliers, but no toes, no output. And productivity will look like sometimes it's very productive and other times it's very productive, when the only thing that differs is this missing object, this little box here that national income and product accounts doesn't include because they don't include the contribution of shoppers. And I'm going to put them. So the US mail needs letters and packages. So the contribution of the shoppers in the production process is both pervasive and unmeasured. So technically, to model this, we pose a search friction. And it is this changing effort over the cycle that households and firms pose is what ultimately varies productivity. And they are the ones who are responsible for what looks like productivity shocks. So I'm going to use very few equations in the next 30, 40 minutes, but I'm going to give you an example using the most beautiful model that we have. It's the Lucas tree. It's beautiful because nothing happens. There is people like fruit, and CT is the fruit, and theta T is just the mood of people. Sometimes I like the fruit more, sometimes I like the fruit less. The technology is that you eat the fruit that there is. And that's it in this model. So what do? You eat the fruit that there is. constraint is just a budget constraint. You own the tree, you buy shares of the tree, or you spend it on fruit. And equilibrium is that output equals consumption equals fruit. There's nothing in here. So what happens? Equilibrium also requires that the trees equals 1. So the only possibility of business cycles here are productivity shock. Sometimes there's a lot of fruit, sometimes there is little fruit. But what about demand shocks, or the willingness of people to consume fruit more often in some circumstances than others? Nothing. In this model, the willingness of people to consume can do nothing. All it does is that if you are hungry, the prices will convince you that you don't want to eat that much. So the good will become more expensive, and we are done. So I'm going to change this way of thinking a little bit. I'm going to change it slightly. So we still have fruit and moodiness of people, but I'm going to put this other object, dt. And the key ingredient is that if you want fruit, you not only have to pay for it, like in the model of the previous slide, but you have to do something else. And what is that something else? You have to find it. You not only have to pay for the fruit, you have to go to the store, find it. And finding requires effort. And this effort goes through a search friction. If you put more effort, you can find more fruit. Now in this world, again, output is productivity. There's no inputs. But now productivity can be affected not only by nature, by that ZT, that the fruit comes more than others, but by the willingness of people to find that fruit. So the way I want to think of it is that when people are hungry, they are able to squeeze more output out of the economy. Squeeze more output in a way that is painful and inconvenient, but they can. And that ability to squeeze that output is going to look as procyclical productivity. Okay, so in this model we have now another variable to get determined, so we need another equation to really solve it. There are many ways of doing it. Competitive search a la Mon is very easy. It provides a very nice way of doing it. Essentially, because it makes the equilibrium optimal. Now, optimality of equilibrium is the light of right-wing conservatives and certain old-fashioned, but I like it for a different reason, because it gives me unique equilibrium and gets it out of the way. So, but in general, you can think of many other ways under which the amount of effort of the economy is determined. So in this world, demand shocks use more willingness to search on the part of households, increase output, and hence you can have business cycles. And these business cycles, the econometrician cannot really tell them apart. You see output going up, and it's in principle hard to say, is it that technology got better, or is it that people got more willing to squeeze output of the economy? But we have an honest contender to have business cycles that are not coming from these productivity shocks that only educated macroeconomists have been able to find. We have something else that can generate both movements in output and productivity. So I'm going to tell you how to use these ideas in a few ways. So there's this paper with Jan Bay and Chet Storrs-Letten. We embodied this thing in a standard stochastic growth model. I'm going to put a very silly demand shocks. Very silly is people are moody and sometimes they don't mind going shopping. So I'm going to put those shocks in there. So think of a standard growth model, normal on everything, except now their output has to be found, and there can be shocks to the willingness of people to look for them. And when you do that, we can estimate the contribution of both demand shocks and true productivity shocks to aggregate fluctuation. Identification in this model is a little bit tricky because it depends on the timing of the variables, but you can do that. You can do a horse race between what do the shocks do. And you know what we found is that there is essentially no role for productivity shocks. But before we do that, I have to deal with some issues. The first one, so what's average capacity? Saying on a normal time, how much output is squeezed out of the economy? The Federal Reserve Board asks managers, what's your actual capacity? How much more could you produce without increasing in higher cost? And the answer is about 81%. So if you go to any restaurant, almost always there are empty tables. If you want to go to the doctor, you can always squeeze in without affecting that. So this is what we think is the average capacity. In this model, firms also have to devote some of its employees to go shopping. And that provides a nice Doyle's theory of relative price of investment. So it's depending on how much energy different groups of people, different groups of shoppers go into goods, firms can sort themselves into specializing to produce consumption or investment, depending on what their usage will be. Now, in this economy, another interesting property is that because firms not only have capital, but they have this ability to be found. They have this possibility of meeting with shoppers. The market value of firms can move around for reasons such as the boring reason that capital moves around. Okay, you put competitive search in here, and now you have a solid residual that you can recover. Just put this economy, and then you can send the NIPA guys to this model economy. You send the NIPA guys, you can tell them, you can calculate the solid residual from what the NIPA guys have computed in this economy. And what we're going to do then is estimate the shocks of this economy from 3 or 4 series, one of them including the solid residual. So we're going to have a technology shock that looks, and it's very close to the productivity, to the solid residual, but it's not the same. And we can estimate this thing using what I'm told are state-of-the-art Bayesian methods. We use 4 series: consumption, investment, the actual TFP shocks, so these are the shocks that we have: consumption demand shocks, people willingness to spend; investment demand shock, this is the ability of firms to invest, just like a technology on firms; shocks to productivity, and this necessary shock in standard RBC models on people's moodiness to work. And we can ask, what's the variance of composition? And the important number here is this one. TFP shocks accounts for nothing. It could have been other ways, and it is the shock to preference accounts for a lot of it. Sorry, this is a shock to preference. And the shock to preference, look at that, accounts for 83% of what everybody else has imputed to technology shocks. So what we get from here is that we have a way of doing, or we have a competitor to technology shocks as an engine of output variation that is based on the demand side, in a way that has all the advantages of the RBC model, which has particular productivity and blah, blah, blah. So let me tell you a second application of this is with international. And this is a project that Jan Bay and I have that we've been working for a while. And it's about the Backus-Smith puzzle that says households consume more domestic goods when they are more expensive. So in the standard RBC model, if you really think that the fluctuations in a multi-world country are given by country-specific advantages to productivity, you see that when things are good in your country, when you have an expansion, productivity is good, what should happen? It should happen that you export more and your value of your good depreciates because there's plenty of it. Well, it turns out that that's not what happens. And in here, if demand shocks are what trigger expansions, what happens is then you increase productivity. If people want to consume more today, you increase productivity in your home country and also abroad, but to a lesser extent. The home good will be more valuable, and this expansion will generate that the country that is doing well appreciates, and also will mean that it will run a current account deficit, and the Banco-Smith puzzle is taken care of. So you get countercyclical terms of trade, volatile net exports, and lower international consumption correlation than output. All these things will get them at the same time. So I think it also has something to say about the nature of how countries are doing relative to each other when they have expansions. A student of mine has also done an application where he partially addresses the Shamar puzzle. The Shamar puzzle is about, in expansions, if workers' output productivity goes up, or the possibility of profits goes up, but then it turns out that in most specifications of the model, workers get most of the additional output, and therefore firms say, I'm not going to hire people if you're going to get them all. So there's been some ways to solve this puzzle by, I'm not going to bore you with them now, but Jan Duras poses one, saying that in expansion, it's the wrong time not to have a job. It's the wrong time not to have a job because now goods are available and the shopping effort you have to put is lower. So it's been used to address this very popular issue in labor economics. But the ones I wanted to talk about today is the recession. And so let's go back to the big question here. Can recessions be the result of impoverishment or of a general increase in savings? So what's going on in Southern Europe? So can we think that one day Spain and Greece discovered that they were much poorer than they thought? Can we think that that is capable of generating a recession? Well, as I said, in the standard growth model, the answer is no. In Greece and Spain, what happens if they got poorer, if suddenly they got a bigger foreign liability than they thought, they would just work harder. And in the previous shopping model, the answer is no. The previous shopping model looks a little bit like Russia in its good old Soviet times. Output was little, people are poor, but they would go hours and hours in line to squeeze every notion of output from production, make sure that nothing goes to waste. So in a model like the one I put, making you poorer would make you search harder and squeeze more output out of the economy. So impoverishment of a country will induce an increase in productivity, an increase in exports, and an expansion. So that's not going to work. However, a couple of things will work. The first one is most of the output is non-tradables, and you cannot immediately transform the production of those espresso into exports. Or in the case of Spain and Greece, the best beaches are taken, and you cannot just double the size of the touristic sector. Again, some limit in the reduction of wages is in place. And now a variant of the shopping model that has the property that negative world effects reduce search and hence productivity. So what we want to do is to think of the shopping ideas, but now if you want to cut your consumption, you're going to cut your search. So how does that work? I'm going to tell you in a second, but these three ingredients will be able to generate a recession. I'm going to call it a balance sheet recession in the sense that what makes you poorer makes you have lower output. So how does that work? Well, look at that utility function. That's the only other equation I'm going to put in there. That is the closest thing to garden variety of love for variety. So people like to consume the more the merrier, but they don't like always the same thing. They want to have varieties, and rho is bigger than 1. But the key thing in here, what makes it different from most models, is that object there is not a 1, it's an I. So that's the number of varieties. So in this world, households have to search for varieties, and its number is a choice. So they have to put effort into finding varieties. So if you want to go to dinner, you want to have some consumption, do you know what you have to do? You have to go to the restaurant. Unless you go to the restaurant, you cannot have dinner in a restaurant. So when you want to cut your consumption, you'll get a cheaper wine and go out fewer times. And it is, the going out will take some search effort. So the number of varieties is going to be the amount of search units that you put times the probability that each search unit finds a variety, and that depends on market tightness. So as I said, when households want to increase consumption, with a suitably chosen utility function, of course, they're going to increase both the number of varieties and the quantity of each variety. Now we're going to be able to have procyclical productivity due to wealth effects. You get poorer cut consumption, choose fewer varieties, more tables in the restaurant will be empty. If more tables in the restaurant will be empty, our friends from NIPA will go and measure that thing as lower productivity. So in this is an environment, the one I just described, with a representative agent where wealth has a form of capital and the firms and the foreign asset position, where the export sector can grow slowly, and where there are such frictions in goods and labor markets. So I'm going to have this economy, and I'm going to take a baseball bat and I'm going to smack it. And I'm going to make the wealth of these guys disappear, disintegrate it overnight. And I'm going to make the net foreign asset position go down as much as I have to generate a 1% decrease in output. Remember, the standard growth model, you hit them with the same band, you have an expansion. But here we'll get a recession. I'm building it so that output goes down by 1%. And you can see that output goes down some, but then it keeps going down for a while. This economy doesn't self-correct by itself. The reason why output goes down only halfway at the beginning is that there is this idle capacity that people are happy to use. But reality kicks in, and the poorer households are going to consume less. And because they cannot take the output that they have and export it, it's just output will be permanently lower. You can see that the solid residual productivity looks like it went down. So remember, output goes down by 1%, productivity goes up by almost 40%. Employment drops and slowly climbs back to recover and past the original thing, because you have to pay the foreigners the wealth that you just lost. Investment also takes a big reduction. It goes down by 7% and starts climbing slowly. And the main reduction is of non-tradables, and tradables slowly climb up. And that slowly climbs up is due to the cost of adjustment, to the adjustment cost. You can see that the number of varieties drops because households are choosing fewer. Its price drops, wages drops, and wealth drops. And the economy has a net export to output ratio that goes up. Now, the key thing, though, is that we had a balance sheet recession. Now, the economy can go into the recession just because people get poorer. Because one day, the Greeks discovered that the government had lied and their foreign debt was much larger. One day, the Spanish discovered that the banks had enormous holes and they're going to be paying for it one way or another. However, the amount of wealth destruction that is needed is way too large. For a 1% reduction in output, the reduction in output, as we see, was about 10% or so. Need a wealth destruction of 10% of total wealth. That's way too much. If without the goods market friction, the wealth destruction would have been much larger. Employment and TFP and consumption, these are all the ingredients of the reduction. In this economy, exports go up immediately because investment can be transformed into exports pretty easily. So goods market friction without shopping, the required size of the shock is much larger, but the recession is too small. Plus, really, where is wealth destruction coming from? Remember the questions that somebody had this morning for you? What is that thing of the wealth destruction? We want to provide a theory of where that's coming from. Okay, so with that, I'm going to go to my last application of this. The Great Recession in the US. Can it be solely due to financial shocks? And these financial shocks induced equilibrium reduction in prices. Can that be the case? Now, these are shocks that affect many households. Well, why? What is this shock? I don't know, perhaps a colossal mistake made by banks, or the end of the implicit government guarantees. But that translated in worse terms of mortgages and for loans for households in distress. So I'm going to get this economy and I'm going to hit it. And this time the hit is not going to be a 10% destruction on wealth. It's going to be a mild reduction in the terms that households can get to buy a house. So what happens after the financial shock happens? Well, housing is no longer as attractive as it used to be. It's relatively more expensive than consumption, and it's certainly more expensive than future consumption. Households want to increase savings to adjust to a larger wealth to income ratio. So financial difficulty says the amount of wealth you need to do everyday business relative to your output goes up. So households respond to the financial shock by reducing consumption and trying to reduce the stock of housing. And they're going to try to work harder, obviously. But this is going to trigger a large recession. And a large recession because there's going to be a large decline in housing prices. And then it's going to make households even more willing to cut consumption. The stock market is going to crash because nobody wants to consume, and productivity, which is at the end a residual object for consumers, is going to go down. So we're going to have a large recession. So what are the ingredients to address such a question? Well, the economy has to have households that can be adversely affected by financial difficulties. But remember what I showed you at the beginning. The wealth to income ratio in the US economy in 2007 was 4.7. Not to income, the wealth to output. Wealth to income rate was about 6. Financial shocks to the average guy, you don't even blink. If my wealth is 6 times my income, my yearly income, I don't care what kind of money the bank will not lend me, because I don't need the bank for anything. So in this economy, there has to be an enormous wealth concentration. We have to make sure that most households, the households that are responsible for consumption, are not too wealthy. But it turns out, you know what? That's the way the US is. In the US, the median household has negative financial wealth. The median household has a mortgage and some equity in the house. Now that household is going to be concerned with the financial shock. As a result of banks, of the lending terms being worse, asset prices, houses, the stock market all respond to market conditions and exacerbate the recession. And the model I'm going to talk about will have all those things responding endogenously. So remember, the whole thing started with households having more difficult to borrow. So what are they going to do? They're going to cut their consumption and try to unload some of the houses. As a result, prices of houses plummet. Cut the consumption even more. That reduces productivity. Firms lose money. The stock market goes down. Cut the consumption even more. But then you're going to lose the jobs. So cut income. Cut the consumption even more. So all these things are going to contribute to the recession. And of course, we have the procyclical productivity. So how do we put these things to work? Well, we have a model that has to be of an Ayagari type structure with an insurable risk and financial frictions. In this world, most households are poor, like the US are, because some people, the way that people get rich in this world is because they become Michael Jordan for a few periods. That gives you motive and opportunity to be rich. Opportunity because you make a lot of money. Even nobody got rich by having a blue-collar job. And motive is because jumping ability is not going to last forever. So when you get that very high individual productivity, you know it's going to last little, you're going to save most of it, and that generates the type of wealth concentration within the US. In this world, there are houses, and the median household will have negative financial assets and have a mortgage plus home equity. So the houses are tricky things. There are some moral hazard implicit in houses, plus the US government contributing to home ownership by not taxing the proceeds of owner-occupied housing. And therefore, people have this crazy, from the point of view of finance, as a position where you put a good chunk of your wealth into this house. And not only that, you're subject to the randomness in the price, because if you buy a house with 30% down, your mortgage is not subject to any housing price risk, only so your equity takes all the risk. So we need to have those things. We also need to have a productive structure where it's difficult to reallocate non-tradables to tradables. Again, in the view of adversity, the economy cannot respond by producing and exporting more or investing more for the future. So the labor market will have some minor form of frictions that will not induce massive declines on the wage. And again, the goods market frictions that reduce TFP and allocation. So on all of this, we have an Ayagari model with all of this, but now we have to compute these changes over time. We have to compute that the equilibrium is not going to be stationary, so we have to compute the equilibrium path of all variables, not only the quantities, labor, output, not only the individual choices of consumption, saving, and housing, but also, more importantly, the market clearing prices for houses on the stock market, and that takes a little bit of work that we are all too tired to look at. So the financial shock reduces the loan-to-value ratio, and immediately households will reduce consumption and save more. Some of them directly, because suddenly they have too much house given their wealth. So some of them will unleash the houses directly, but then others, because they'll see that they are too close for comfort to the borrowing limit. So for that, they also want to unleash the houses. So this reduction in house holdings is going to dramatically reduce housing prices and further reduce consumption. And we have the recession that is exacerbated by endogenous procyclical productivity. Now remember, I told you in the previous model, in the previous world where there was no housing and was a representative agent, that the size of the shock was too large to be sensible. Wealth had to be, 10% of wealth had to disappear overnight. But I'm going to do something very small now. The down payment is going to go from 25 to 32% over 6 months, very slowly. Remember, this is an economy where the down payment is very, very large. The US is 0. But technically, I'm not capable of having households that are under with all these complications. So I want to make sure that nobody goes broke. So this is a tiny little thing. The down payment from 25 to 32 over 4 periods, which is just 6 weeks, so that unemployment looks like the data. And I'm going to make a tiny, tiny increase in the markup from 0 to 0.3%. And I'll show you what happens. Okay, so this is an economy that for all practical purposes is having a small inconvenience. But look at what happens. There are 2 economies in here. One with fixed wage, the red, one with relatively flexible wage, the blue, where factor shares are almost constant. So take your pick. Use your prior about the extent of of wage rigidity in the market. And look at the drop in output, between 3 and 5% immediately. So output goes between 3 and 5% overnight, only because households have increased difficulty to borrow, where the down payment goes from 25 to 32. Now, my friends that wanted to buy houses in 2007, 2008, 2009 tell me that the changes were much more dramatic. The change in the terms, or the changes in the ability of getting mortgages was much, much larger than what we have in this model. Unemployment goes from 6 to 9 or 12 overnight. There's a dramatic decrease. The decrease is mostly in consumption. But due to the adjustment cost, investment also drops. There's nothing. Investment doesn't want to grow. Why not? Well, the non-tradables, the espresso machines, nobody wants them, so that's not going to go. And the adjustment costs in the export sector are so large that the economy doesn't want to massively, households don't want to go too fast in producing color TV factories to export because it's too costly. What happens to wealth? Well, total wealth, just because of this change, goes down by 7%. So remember, the wealth to output ratio was 4.7, went down by 7%, means 40% of GDP disappears overnight from the pockets of people. Households deleverage, as it did in the data. And the housing price, which was only about 1.7 GDPs before the recession, goes down 18%. Remember, I could make it go more if I had a bigger computer. If I was able to manage to have houses going under having foreclosures in this relatively complicated model, then housing price could go even more just from financial difficulty. Okay. But what happened to TFP? Well, TFP also goes down. And labor quality goes down. And if you measure TFP with total labor inputs, you get exactly the picture of the Great Recession that I put at the beginning, with these small shocks. So this financial shock causes a Great Recession, and even though our environment is still limited, because we have some things I would like to change. The first one is that houses are frictionless. You can buy and sell your house in this model easily. And bankruptcies and foreclosures do not exist. So these two things will make the mess much larger, because it will make much losses transmitted to other parts of the economy. But in addition, and my friends in international tell me that I'm doing something wrong, investment and exports are perfect substitutes. And because I only have two sectors, when investment plummets, and it plummeted 30%. So if investment is about 20% of GDP, that's 30% that disappears. That's about 6% of GDP. Well, that immediately in this model can be exported at no cost. And we know from the crisis of when countries get into a sudden stop and the whole thing goes down, then imports disappear, but exports don't pick up. It takes time to pick exports. So I would like to expand this model into having three sectors so that exports cannot, the goods that used to be invested cannot be exported overnight. But still, despite this limitation, we have a quantitatively sound account of the Great Recession. And this is triggered only by financial tightness. And this is financial tightness on households, not on firms. It's not the firms that cannot borrow, which is what everybody has worried about, is on households. But you know what? Our theory, and this is essentially what the last thing I'm going to say, can also account for the expansion before 2007. But we're going to ask, is it, Jacobiello has been documented that the expansion of credit was associated to a smaller expansion of consumption than an equal size reduction of credit. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to reduce the down payment from 25 to 17.5%, also over a span of 6 months. And look at that. Output immediately jumps but only 1.5%. And this is the same change in the down payment that they had before, where the recession was 3 to 5%. Immediately here, output goes only up by 1%, but goes up. Unemployment goes down from 6 to 5. Consumption goes up by 2%. Investment goes up by 12%, and clearly exports are what goes down. But the economy has a big increase in wealth of 3%. Remember, output was 1, wealth is 3. Households' indebtedness grows quite a lot, 10%, and there's a big jump in housing price from about 8%. And here, whatever your priors about wage flexibility are irrelevant since the expansion is of equal size. TFP goes up, labor quality goes down, etc. And all of this is pretty much what happened before the 2008. I didn't want to show the two things together because you always have to deal with the tricky issue of what did people believe what would happen and what time will the good times end in terms of credit access. So that's why I went from 2007 both into bad times and into good times. So let me conclude. I don't want to keep you for a second away from the promised drinks in 4th floor. So let me conclude by saying I've made the case to abandon one of the most revered objects in macro, which is the production function. This might be good for growth, but it severely courses our understanding of business cycles, only paying lip service to growth theory. And it provides a thing that what I've told you about, this shopping of good market frictions, it provides a way out of our addictive dependence on productivity shocks as a trigger for fluctuation. And again, let me say it for one more time, only us have ever seen those things. Try to talk to other people, they haven't. And we have, so I said we shouldn't do that, and I have come with a theoretically solid alternative that if you even playing the narrow game of the RBC model, it can beat it in the sense that Bayesian techniques impute movements in productivity to preference shocks, not to technology shocks. And it helps to make sense of the recessions due to household impoverishment. And I think this is important, or adverse financial shocks as in Southern Europe. But mostly it accounts for the main facts of the Great Recession. And it's well suited to work with heterogeneous agents model because you need those to make sense of why financial shocks can affect people. If an economy, as I said, if wealth is 6 times income on average, why should you care of what banks do? Well, you care because you're not average, you're just median. And if you're median, you are poor. And if you're poor and you like a house, you have to borrow. And I hope that just some of you think this way at some point in the future. And thanks very much.
Okay. Thanks, Baxter, for his enlightening talk, with a lot of new directions, we can do in the future. We have about 2-3 minutes, so maybe we can take maybe 1 or 2 burning questions. Well,
Hi, David. I think it's you, isn't it? Yep, that's what I thought.
So I guess I'm reminded a little bit here of this sort of razor's edge. If these economies are so delicate as your model seems to indicate, it seems like we should see much bigger fluctuations day to day, week to week, month to month, year to year than we see in fact. I mean, we see, if you could introduce these small shocks to create big recessions, why don't we see big recessions all the time? If you can make small changes and get big booms, why don't we get big booms all the time? That seems to me to be a bit of a problematic aspect here, right? We've seen shocks of this kind of magnitude all the time in all sorts of economies. They don't go wild, either crashing or blowing up.
I don't think I've seen shocks or changes as dramatic or changes in the ability of people to borrow that we've seen in the last 15 years. Before 2000, the mortgage market was boring. no action was there. And then suddenly the terms got better and better and easier. And the same thing, it changed. So what you call big or small shocks, I just haven't seen that type of action in the lending market.
So the savings and loan crisis was associated with big changes in the mortgage market too, but it didn't trigger off anywhere near of a size of recession, and the boom that preceded it was nowhere near as great as in current times. So there have been other big changes in mortgage markets over time. There was the introduction, at one time all mortgages were fixed rate mortgages. There was change to variable rate mortgages. There have been huge changes in mortgage markets and the terms of trade in mortgage markets over the last decades. But we haven't seen these since World War II. This is the biggest thing we've seen by quite a substantial amount. And yet you seem to be arguing that changes in mortgage markets, the order that we have seen repeatedly throughout the last 30, 50 years, somehow triggered it off this time, but not the other times. That's the thing that I find a little bit difficult about this argument.
Okay, so we are repeating each other at the beer's time. You keep saying that these things have happened repeatedly, and I don't think
Well, I did give
have.
examples, but we'll talk about it at
The
beer.
savings and loans was an issue of some companies had the wrong assets and liability structure. It was not what affected households. It was just those banks had a position and cost them 2 or 3% of GDP that was paid over time by the taxpayer. But I don't recall such a big change in the ability of people to borrow. But that said, you may have a point about be careful of what you are calling the bad guy, because if you see him over and over, you'll have to be scared of him over and over. At that point, I certainly take it well.
Okay, thanks, Victor. So we can go upstairs to the 4th floor. I think the bar should be ready already.